Smith Wigglesworth faced a moment so terrifying that most people would have completely broken down. Instead, he stood firm, refusing to bow to the fear in front of him. Tonight, we look at exactly what happened and where that kind of courage actually comes from. Wigglesworth traveled extensively throughout his ministry, preaching and praying for the sick across England, Europe, and eventually much further afield, often in places where illness, danger, and hardship were simply part of daily life, long before modern travel and medicine made such journeys as safe as they are today. On one particular journey, according to accounts passed down by those close to him, he found himself gravely ill himself, his own body failing rapidly, in circumstances far from home and far from the kind of medical care that might have reassured a lesser man. Those around him at the time genuinely believed he was dying, and by his own account later, he felt the weight of death pressing in on him as heavily and as physically real as anything he had ever experienced. Think about the strangeness of this moment for a man so famous for praying for other people's healing. Here was Wigglesworth, the man whose hands had been laid on the sick in country after country, now facing what felt like his own final hour, with no guarantee that the outcome would go any differently for him than it might for anyone else. According to the story, rather than spending his remaining strength in panic or despair, Wigglesworth did something that struck everyone who witnessed it. He refused to simply lie back and accept what looked, by every natural measure, like an approaching death. He spoke directly against it, out loud, the same bold, authoritative language he had used for years praying over others, except now aimed at his own body and his own circumstance. Witnesses said he declared that he would not die in that place, that his work was not yet finished, and he continued declaring scripture over himself even while barely able to move. Those who were present that day described a striking contrast between the visible physical weakness in his body and the steadiness in his voice as he continued speaking truth aloud, verse after verse, refusing the silence that fear usually demands in moments like that. There was no dramatic display for an audience, no performance meant to impress anyone watching. It was simply a dying man refusing to let his final conscious moments, whether or not they turned out to actually be final, be surrendered to terror rather than to the truth he had spent his entire life proclaiming to others. Whether you read this story as dramatic legend passed down through admiring followers, or as a faithful account of an actual moment in his life, the principle behind it is worth examining carefully, because it reflects something Wigglesworth taught consistently throughout his ministry about how faith is meant to respond when death itself feels close. Look at how Paul described his own relationship with the fear of death in Philippians, chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. He wrote from prison, genuinely uncertain whether he would live or be executed, and said, "I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Notice that Paul wasn't pretending death held no weight or significance. He was declaring that regardless of which direction his circumstance went, he refused to let fear dictate his posture in that moment. Wigglesworth pointed to this passage often, saying it captured exactly the kind of settled confidence every believer is meant to carry. Not because death doesn't matter, but because it no longer holds the same terror once you truly believe what Scripture says about what lies beyond it. Wigglesworth taught that fear of death often operates like any other spiritual attack, something meant to paralyze a believer at precisely the moment they need clarity and courage the most. He said the enemy frequently saves his heaviest assaults from moments of physical weakness, when a person is least equipped naturally to resist, precisely because that's when fear can do the most damage if left unchallenged. Look at how Hebrews chapter 2 verses 14 and 15 describes exactly this dynamic. It says, "Christ shared in our humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death." Notice the phrase, slavery by their fear of death. Wigglesworth pointed out that this verse describes something believers are meant to be entirely freed from, not a fear they're simply expected to endure and manage for their whole lives. The freedom described here is real and complete, available the moment a believer actually appropriates what Christ already accomplished. This is why Wigglesworth believed refusing to bow to the fear of death, even in a moment that looked genuinely dire, wasn't reckless bravado or denial of reality. It was simply acting on what Scripture had already declared true, the same posture he brought to every other area of his faith. If Christ had genuinely broken the power of death's fear, as Hebrews states plainly, then a believer facing even a life-threatening moment had real grounds to stand firm rather than collapse into the very terror Christ died to free them from. Wigglesworth often pointed his listeners to the example of the 3 men in the book of Daniel, chapter 3, thrown into a blazing furnace for refusing to bow to a golden image. Before they were thrown in, they told the king plainly that God was able to rescue them, but even if he chose not to, they still would not bow. Wigglesworth said this distinction mattered enormously. Their courage wasn't contingent on guaranteed rescue. They were prepared to stand firm regardless of the outcome, trusting God's character even if the fire took their lives. He said this was the same posture available to any believer facing death itself. Not certainty that the outcome will always go the way we hope, but a settled refusal to let fear dictate our response regardless of how the story actually ends. Think about how this teaching applies practically, because most of us will never face the exact dramatic scenario described in this story, but nearly everyone eventually faces their own version of staring death, loss, or overwhelming fear directly in the face, whether through illness, grief, or simply the slow approach of life's final season. Wigglesworth's example points to a posture available in those moments that most people never consider, actively speaking truth against the fear rather than simply absorbing it, passively as an unavoidable emotional response. He taught that this doesn't mean pretending death isn't serious, or acting as though grief and fear aren't real, legitimate human experiences. Even Jesus wept at Lazarus's tomb, fully present to real grief, even knowing he was about to raise Lazarus back to life moments later. Wigglesworth's own example wasn't about suppressing real emotion. It was about refusing to let fear have the final, controlling word over his response, the same distinction he taught regarding faith and doubt in other areas of his ministry. This mirrors the same principle Wigglesworth taught elsewhere about doubt sitting alongside genuine faith. Just as he believed a person could honestly feel uncertain while still choosing to act in faith, he believed a person could honestly feel the natural weight and fear of a life-threatening moment while still choosing to speak truth over it rather than surrender entirely to the fear itself. The emotion and the declaration were never meant to cancel each other out. One was the honest human experience. The other was the deliberate choice of where to plant his feet regardless of what he was currently feeling. Here's something important to hold alongside this story. Wigglesworth never taught that faith guarantees escape from every dangerous circumstance, and his own life eventually ended the way every human life does, through natural death in his later years. This particular story about facing apparent death and recovering wasn't meant to promise that faith always results in physical rescue from every dangerous moment. It was meant to illustrate a posture of the heart, refusing to let fear dictate your spiritual response, regardless of how the actual circumstance eventually unfolds. This distinction matters enormously because it protects this teaching from becoming a promise Scripture never actually made. The point was never that bold declarations guarantee physical outcomes. The point was that even facing something as serious and final feeling as death itself, a believer doesn't have to be enslaved by terror, because Christ has already broken that particular chain, regardless of what happens next in the body. Think about how much unnecessary suffering comes specifically from the fear surrounding death, separate from death itself. Countless people spend years of their lives quietly dreading a moment that hasn't even arrived yet. Losing sleep, losing peace, losing the ability to actually live fully in the present because a future fear has taken up permanent residence in their mind. Wigglesworth's teaching wasn't really about the moment of death itself. It was about reclaiming every day leading up to it from a fear that was never meant to hold that much power over a believer's life. So what does this mean for whatever fear feels closest to death in your own life right now? Whether that's an actual health crisis, a season of grief, or simply anxiety about your own mortality that quietly presses in during quiet moments. Wigglesworth's example points toward a response available to you too, not a formula for guaranteed rescue, but a genuine posture of standing firm rather than being controlled by a fear Christ already came to break. Bring the fear honestly before God, the way Wigglesworth did in that dire moment, but don't stop at simply absorbing the terror passively. Speak truth back to it. Remind yourself of what Christ has already accomplished regarding the power death once held over you. Trust that the freedom described in Hebrews is real and available, not a distant theological idea, but something you can actually stand on in your own hardest moments. Take a moment right now and bring whatever fear of loss, illness, or mortality has been quietly pressing on you honestly before God. Speak His truth back to that fear, the same way Wigglesworth refused to let fear have the final word in his own darkest moment, and trust that the freedom Christ purchased is real for you too. If this encouraged you to face a fear honestly tonight, say so in the comments. And if you want to keep hearing the truths men like Wigglesworth were never afraid to preach, stay here with us. There's so much more still to see.